F1.
Red flags to slow down. What?
The checkered flag is waiting.
I can see our Checkered Flag podcast being quite spicy.
5 Live's Checkered Flag podcast.
Hello, I'm Harry Benjamin, and we are fresh off the back of the Belgian Grand Prix sprint race, a very wet and rainy affair, a delayed start, several formation laps, and then a rolling start as we got underway. The former McLaren mechanic Mark Priestley called all the action alongside me. And Mark, it was a delayed start. We finally got going, and we were wondering how quickly was this track going to dry up. They started on the full wets, of course, Verstappen ahead of Oscar Piastri, and then exactly half the field came into the pits, led by Oscar Piastri, to change to the intermediate tyre. The other half, including Max Verstappen, stayed out on the wets.
Yeah, amazing start to this sprint afternoon, wasn't it? I mean, the rain falling at exactly that moment when all the cars were already on the grid ready to take the race start on dry tyres. It was bone dry everywhere, blue skies. Within 5 minutes, it was pouring down with rain, and we got delayed starts and all of those things that you just referred to. The fact that everybody, or half the field rather, piled into the pit lane caused chaos in the pit lane itself, because the pit lane's not used to that many cars coming in at once. There were what seemed like unsafe releases on a number of occasions, and they went unnoticed, or at least uninvestigated. Got away with that. But it did mean that as they all emerged, and the field that came in for the change went on to Inters and emerged back on track, it was Oscar Piastri, the rookie in the McLaren in his first year in this sport, who emerged at the front of the field ahead of the double world champion Max Verstappen.
And he did, and he managed to keep that lead for a few laps, with Verstappen was closing on him, but then the safety car changed things up, and that allowed Verstappen to close right on to the back of Piastri, and as soon as the safety car came in, it was writing on the wall, really, wasn't it, for Piastri?
There was nothing he could do. I mean, the simple fact is that Red Bull is an absolute rocket ship. We keep hearing that word, but it's true. And on a circuit like this, which is all about high speed, it's got that very long Kemmel straight, which is where he got the job done. He just had nothing in answer to the speed and the pace of that Red Bull racing car. I have to say, I thought Oscar Piastri did a really solid job of the restart. He's never done that before in Formula One. He found himself in unfamiliar territory, leading the field out of a safety car period in a Formula One competitive race situation. I thought he did a really good job, but when it came down to it on the high-speed Kemmel straight, there was nothing he could do.
No match for Verstappen in the end, who really did drive by on that Kemmel straight, but it was the first time really that we've seen, that unpredictability of rain coming down right as they were all lining up on the grid, getting ready for lights out. You were a mechanic, you were in that exact position where you're having to get the awnings out, you're having to prepare for what tyre you're going to start this race. Is it going to be a safety car restart? Is it going to be full wet mandatory? Is it going to be an intermediate? Is it going to dry up? How do you mentally prepare yourself as part of the team when you're in that situation?
Yeah, it can be difficult, because Formula One grid procedures tend to be quite formulaic. Most races are dry, so you have a fairly set procedure that's timed down to almost military precision. You know when the tyres are going to go on, you know when you're going to fire the engines up to warm them up, you know when the driver's going to get in, you know when you've got to clear the grid ahead of the race start. All these things are regimented and set. But a moment like that, when the rain suddenly comes down, it throws you into disarray and chaos. And Formula One teams, organisationally, typically are very good at dealing with that kind of stuff. They are the best in the business, but it still just throws you a little bit. And, from a mechanic and an engineering point of view, what you're looking for is information from race control about how long the delay is going to be. You're looking for information from your weather systems, your radar. How intense is this rain going to be? How long is it going to last? Because there are some big decisions that have to be made. As it turned out today, the FIA decided relatively quickly that the race was going to start behind the safety car, and that meant that the decision around tyres was taken out of their hands. They had to start on the full wet, which by the time we actually got going after all of those extended formation laps, turned out that the full wet tyre was the wrong tyre to be on, and it was the intermediate was the fastest tyre, and that's what triggered all of those early pit stops.
Safety is obviously a massive concern when it's conditions like this, as you say there. Do you think it was the right call, though, to do the several, it ended up being 4 or 5 formation laps we got in the end behind the safety car, and then the rolling restart?
Yeah, I think it probably was. It's always very difficult to argue against a call on safety, and particularly a circuit like this, Spa, it's very high speed in nature. It's had its fair share of safety incidents, some of them very tragic in recent times, and so there is a sort of hesitancy from anybody, and you can understand it, to just say, right, let's just get on with it. I'm sure many fans will be sitting at home saying, you know, they used to race in conditions worse than this in the olden days, let's crack on. But you've got to take into consideration safety, especially in this modern era. I kind of think it was probably the right call. And look at what we got in the end. We've still got some fantastic racing, so you can't say that the decision they made detracted from any of that.
No, absolutely, I agree with you. And actually, several drivers, including Verstappen, coming on the radio during that build-up and agreeing with what Niels Wittich, the race director, was wanting to achieve with the race beginning in the conditions that it did. But it was Verstappen who did win that battle, although minimal, with Oscar Piastri on track. And we can hear what Verstappen said after the race.
Max, congratulations. You are today's sprint winner. Once again, unstoppable. But the start didn't seem so simple. You chose to opt to stay out and only come in, for instance, on the second lap. Was that the wrong call?
No, I think it was just a safer call. I mean, I could come in first, but then I might be blocked by other cars. There might be a safety car, and then you lose out massively. So I didn't mind to stay out. I mean, we lost one position, but we know that we are quick, and I think you could see that when we put the inter tires on, we were flying. So it was okay.
We heard you mention on the radio that you were struggling to wake up your brakes. However, you still had a lead of over 6 seconds at the end. So how much of a struggle was that in the car for you?
No, we just trying to get an even split on the brakes, but it was all under control. The car was quick, tires were holding on. Just tiny little issues.
Well, tomorrow you start down in 6th. Was there anything to learn when following Oscar yesterday in these conditions from behind first place?
I don't know. I mean, I need to pass a few cars, so I think the biggest risk is just lap 1, turn 1. All these kind of things. Everything is always very tricky there. So as long as we stay out of trouble, I think we'll have a quick car.
Max Verstappen there, I mean, it was always inevitable that he was probably going to win the race unless something dramatic happened, but. At the start, when Piastri came in first for the pits for the intermediate tyre, it almost didn't matter really, because Max Verstappen, such is the advantage he has as a driver and with that car, that he probably could have stayed out. Okay, maybe an extra lap, 2 extra laps might have been a bit much, but he can afford to take that gamble and stay out a bit longer, because even if he drops back, he knows he could just carve through again.
Yeah, it's an advantage that them and the team have created for themselves. You've got to take your hats off to them for that. They've delivered an incredible car with such dominant performance. That affords them that luxury of being able to make a number of different decisions and still come out on top. The real decision at that moment in the race wasn't, do we stay out for 3 or 4 laps? It was either going to be, do we pit now before the race actually officially gets underway, or do we pit the lap after? Everybody knew it was going to be intermediate tyres. For Max Verstappen, though, it's always harder to pit out of the lead of a Grand Prix or a lead of a race. You have the advantage of the track position. You've got a clear track in front of you. You're not dealing with spray. So the decision was really a fairly obvious one for Verstappen and Red Bull. Stay out for 1 more lap. Let those behind do what they want to do, knowing that you have the outright pace to make up any deficit that you might find yourself with.
Yeah, well, it was his second sprint race win of the season in the end for Max Verstappen. Rather foreboding once more for the Grand Prix tomorrow. We'll come on to that shortly. But second place was Oscar Piastri, as we've mentioned, an absolutely tremendous drive, a tremendous weekend so far for Piastri. Both McLarens have shown improved pace since these upgrades were applied in Austria, first to Norris, then Piastri got them in Silverstone, and it was like somebody flicked a switch and Piastri was right up there with him. This weekend so far, Piastri seems that he's actually had a bit of an edge over Lando Norris. In fact, this is his best finish in any kind of race format, let's generalise it like that, in his career. So it's a shame it's not a podium, technically, but it's still a second place finish.
I think he'll call it a podium, won't he? I mean, a second place is wonderful, and it really is testament to the sort of trajectory that him and the team McLaren are on right now. And it's really nice to see, because the reason this has come about is they had confidence to make that early decision. That's a difficult call to make when you're sat in second place, the highest position you've been in your career as a driver. To make a decision to pit from second place is a tough one, particularly when you see the guy in front of you continuing on. They made that decision, that took confidence, and that confidence has come from the recent weekends they've had where double podiums and then another podium for Lando Norris. So the team is in good shape. They're starting to believe in this car, they're starting to understand it. But I think the biggest thing for me is exactly as you just said. This particular circuit, in these conditions, which have been changeable all weekend, it's Oscar Piastri who's been the lead driver out of those two McLarens. He's been the most comfortable in that car, and I think that will do him no end of good, particularly as we've still got one more event. He won't want this weekend to ever end. He's got another race that he can take in tomorrow, and he starts in a reasonable position for it.
He does. He will start 5th for tomorrow's Grand Prix, which is actually probably a little bit of a disappointment in the end for him, the rate of knots that he was going. But, I mean, one of the stats that there's being chucked around for Piastri, the first rookie to lead any race format since 2013. That was Esteban Gutierrez. I mean, it doesn't really say much, but it just underlines, I think, out of all the rookies so far this year, we started with 3, we've lost 1, haven't we? Nick De Vries, Logan Sargent in the Williams, a different story. Piastri coming alive, and he's got a really good team around him as well, hasn't he? They made all the right calls. Remember, he could well have been at Alpine this year. That didn't happen. He's at McLaren. He's got Mark Webber in terms of guidance. You've witnessed drivers, rookie drivers coming into teams, Lewis Hamilton coming into that team, McLaren. How important is it to have the right people around you when you're starting your career?
Yeah, it's huge. And that's not just the people that you work with directly in terms of the engineering team, the mechanics. It's not just the people inside the team. As you rightly say, it's the people like the Mark Webbers, it's the management, it's the support, it's your family. These are young kids. He's 22 years old, the youngest driver on the grid. He needs emotional support, he needs guidance from every aspect of his life, which has changed beyond belief in the last year or so. He's got things like financial decisions to make. He needs guidance on that. And all of these things, as happens with any young person, as you're coming through your early 20s, your life is changing beyond belief. You're having to make big life decisions as well as career decisions, but he's playing this out in front of the world. So, look, I think he's in a good place. This will do him, as I said, no end of good. And I think he's on a really nice path towards some bigger and greater things.
Well, he'll certainly be taking some confidence from this P2 finish in the sprint, but let's hear what he had to say about it.
Hey Oscar, well, congratulations on second in that race. I know you would have wanted the win having led that race, but are you pretty happy with how things have gone, all things considered?
Yeah, definitely. I think, it would have been very difficult to hold Max behind. Clearly he was a lot quicker. So yeah, I was happy with it. I think we did the right call, made the right call to box straight away, got ourselves in a winning position, and yeah, we just didn't have enough pace after. So happy with everything we did. There was nothing more left in that, so a very good day.
The car looks so good around here. You specifically look so good around here. How excited are you about the prospect of a longer race in dry conditions tomorrow?
I'd probably prefer if it was wet, if I'm honest. We've got some big strengths and some big weaknesses too. Namely our straight line speed and our sector 2 pace. So we'll see what we can do. I think we saw even now how much more straight line speed Red Bull had than us. It was no contest really. So we'll see what we've got tomorrow. Hopefully we can stay in the points. I think going forwards is going to be quite tricky because the cars around us are a very similar pace, but we'll try our best. And as the weather's been doing anything and everything this weekend, so maybe it'll do the same tomorrow.
Oscar Piastri then finishing in second behind Verstappen, but it was Pierre Gasly. We talked about Alpine and the Piastri nearly going there. Alpine have been the centre of a storm this weekend for their off-track antics, a huge change in the management role with Otmar Zafnauer leaving the team after this weekend, along with Alan Permain, the sporting director, and Otmar, the team principal. But at least on track, Pierre Gasly giving them something to smile about with a P3 finish. In fact, it ties with the most amount of points he's scored in any kind of race this year so far, which I think underlines Alpine's season in general. But he was so happy at the end of the radio, but he had his work cut out for him because he had Lewis Hamilton right behind him for the majority of that race in the closing stages.
He did, didn't he? It's a rare moment of good news in recent times for anybody in the Alpine team, and I guess they need that. Yesterday, Friday, that was a tough day for the team because the media was all about the speculation and the chaos that surrounds the management and the changes that are happening there. People leaving in this exodus, as it seems, over the last 18 months. Today they could celebrate, and that's important because there's still another day of this weekend, and it needs to be a positive one. This is, don't forget, it's the last race before the summer break when Formula One shuts down for weeks. the last thing you want to be doing is going into that with a negativity running through your organisation. So if they can finish the weekend strong, and today's the first part of that really, that could be a really nice way for them to go into their summer holidays.
When you get that, when it is the last race before half term, basically, particularly from a mechanics point of view, do you feel like you are a little bit lax? Are you a bit tired? Are you counting down the days so you can go on your holiday on Monday?
Well, that is the risk, because just like when you're at school, it is that end of term feeling, but that's what a Formula One team has to make sure doesn't happen, and that there are measures that they put in place, there are meetings that happen, there's reminders not to let your guard down, because it's very easy to do that. Same at the last race of the season. If you're not fighting for a championship, it's quite easy just to become a little bit slack, and I'm talking about 0.5% here or there, but in Formula One those things make a difference. So they've got to be vigilant, they've got to be on their toes, and they've got to treat this race like any other.
Well, certainly wasn't lax from Pierre Gasly in the end. P3 finish for him and his Alpine. Here's what he said after the race.
Pierre, great to see you smiling again after what was a mega result. Just how satisfying is it to finish on the top three?
I'm super happy. I'm super happy for the whole team. We've been pretty unlucky in the recent events, and then we managed to put a very strong qualifying this morning, put it in P6. Took the risk at the right time, fit the inters, and fight until the end to try to hold on Lewis right behind. So it was an intense race, but I really enjoyed these conditions, and then it's a sprint race, it's a sprint podium. It doesn't feel quite like a real podium, but I still take the little third plate, and then I think the most important is more for the team, for the guys, the mood inside the garage, and that's why I'm really happy.
Yeah, you mentioned the team was such a difficult day for you guys yesterday with all the news that was happening. How good is this for the morale for the team and encouraging for tomorrow as well?
Yeah, I mean, especially knowing that the guys are gonna go on a break in about 48 hours, and it's been, it hasn't been easy since the start of the year. We haven't been as competitive as we would have liked, and Hungary was a bit of an example of what's happening since the start. We got involved in a collision, lost the two cars, so it was quite a heavy and frustrating last couple of weeks, and to be able to put a strong performance at this time, and also personally in Spa, which is obviously a very special track. With Antoine and what's happened, the history of the track, it's a very meaningful third place.
Pierre Gasly there after his P3 finish on what is an emotional weekend for him, of course. He lost one of his closest friends in the world of motorsport, lost a huge figure in Antoine Hubert back in 2019, the Formula 2 driver involved in an incident here at Spa, which sadly took his life, and even recently as well, the young racer Delano Van der Hoff in the Formula Regional race that was here just a month or so ago, also sadly passing away, and Pierre Gasly did a brilliant run that was organised for everybody in the paddock that he led on the Thursday to run the circuit in memory of Antoine Hubert and Delano Van der Hoff. So an emotional weekend for Pierre Gasly. I'm sure he'll be delighted to honour those drivers, his friend Antoine Hubert as well, with that P3 finish, and that will buoy him into the Grand Prix tomorrow, where he's got a little bit more work to do, starting from further back in the pack. He was just ahead though of Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc in 4th and 5th, then came Lando Norris, but some of the major action to take place in this sprint race was involved Sergio Perez, and was kicked off with his fight with Lewis Hamilton. Now they were going side by side, toe to toe in the run towards Blanchimont, the fast left-hand king. Then, and this the battle over P4, then contact, only slight, but it was enough to ruin Perez's race.
Yeah, it was, and it's such a shame, because look, I think most people in and around Formula One want to see Sergio Perez have a good weekend from start to finish. It hasn't happened for a long time. Last time I had a good race day, but a terrible qualifying. He just hasn't had a clean weekend where he can really show what he can do, and once again that's happened. He was in a good position. I mean, that's the positive. He was in a good position, not quite matching his teammate, which is ultimately where he needs to be, but he was in a strong position. And it was great racing between Hamilton and Perez. It was wheel to wheel in really treacherous conditions, dancing around that very narrow drying line as they were on that part of the circuit. And it was Hamilton as they came through the right-hander who was just on the inside of Perez and maybe lost the control by a tiny amount. A small correction on the steering wheel just slid his car into the side pod of Sergio Perez, bumped him wide. They both kind of got away with it and continued, but Sergio Perez emerged with a giant hole in the side of his side pod. He tumbled down the order, and I'm not sure that was entirely down to the hole in the side pod. It wouldn't have helped, but I think his tyres are already going off. He fell down the order, catapulted towards the back, people overtaking left, right and centre, and eventually, whether the damage was too bad, it did look like maybe the radiator had been damaged inside the side pod itself, but ultimately the team had to retire that car.
Now, Hamilton got a penalty for that, 5-second time penalty applied at the end of the race, which meant because he finished right behind Gasly in 4th, but with the penalty he ended up coming home in 7th, so he only picks up a couple of points in the end for his trouble. As it was unfolding, to me, it looked like great racing action side by side in tricky conditions, and mistakes do happen, but it wasn't malicious, it wasn't vindictive. I think that was quite a harsh penalty to be applied to Hamilton.
And I agree with you, it was great racing, and the last thing we want to do is apply penalties to these borderline situations that then discourage drivers from taking the risks that deliver that great racing we're after. I think it could have been one of those, and I think the point with that incident was it was so on the cusp that if they had decided after an investigation no penalty was necessary, we'd have all gone, yeah, fair enough. As it was, they came down on the other side of that very fine line, and having looked at it a few times now, I think you can justify the decision to give Hamilton a penalty, but it's so close that it could have easily gone the other way. We'd have sat here gone, yeah, fair point.
I wonder as well if, because ultimately it did lead to Sergio Perez retiring from the race, and whether that is the clincher in terms of the FIA book.
I always struggle with that, because you should penalise the incident, not the result of that incident, in my opinion, because, you know, whether it might have been Lewis Hamilton that had the failure on a car further down the line, it could have been Sergio Perez. So I think you penalise the driving incident if that's what it's declared to be. If it's unfair, if it's unsafe, if it breaches rules, penalise it. I'm always I'm hesitant to sort of look at the results, because they can happen 10 laps further into the race as a result of some damage. Do you then go back and say, okay, now the incident was more serious? I'm not a big fan of that. But I think it was a fair penalty, but also harsh.
Well, with the penalty applied, Lewis Hamilton came home in 7th in the sprint race. Let's hear what he had to say.
Hey Lewis, it was great to see you fighting out there, and I thought it was a decent move on Checo, and you obviously got that 5-second penalty, so I just wanted your thoughts on that, really.
I mean, I feel like it was a racing incident, but it does feel like it was a racing incident, and in the trickiest of conditions. But I was more than halfway up alongside him, but a bit unfortunate.
The pace of the car looked good in those conditions. You were chasing Pierre at the end, and I know you had that penalty come in, but that must have been a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, I'll just say that we're supposed to be racing out there, and those sorts of penalties just deter you from racing, and what are they expecting us to do? You know, it's the trickiest conditions out there. So I don't even know what the last question was.
No, that's right. I was just saying you were chasing Pierre. The pace of the car looked good, and in those conditions, it looked good for you guys.
There's certain characteristics that we're struggling with our car, but it was okay. We're ultimately 4th with the penalty, 7th. It's a bit of you don't really get a lot of points anyway in this session, so we'll try and fix the car for tomorrow and hope for a better race tomorrow.
So that was Lewis Hamilton there, who finished in 7th. Sergio Perez then retired from this race, as we mentioned, but it's the P word again, isn't it, Mark? Pressure on Perez. Just when we would think he was actually having, up until now, almost a bit of a quieter weekend, but he was up there. He wasn't matching Verstappen like for like, but he was at least in the top 4, top 6. He wasn't languishing down in P18 like he has done in several qualifying so far this year, or P9, but then it just all fell away from him. Does he have an issue at the moment with that P word, with pressure? As soon as one thing goes wrong, it all goes wrong.
Yeah, I mean, look, it does point towards that, particularly in recent weeks when we talk about his sort of failures or his struggles in qualifying. I mean, that's the highest pressure situation. Typically, it's all over one flying lap with the cars at their fastest, and that's where he seems to have come unstuck. On race day, he's put in some pretty decent performances. Hungary, last time out, being one of those where we recovered through the field. But look, I have to look at this through a pretty harsh lens, and I say that Red Bull car is so much quicker than any other car on this grid. Perez, if he's not second behind Verstappen, something's gone wrong. So yes, we can look at what's happened this weekend, and he's back up there or thereabouts inside the top 5. That's not good enough in a Red Bull car, in my opinion. I want to see him do well. I want to see him recover from this spell, and I want to see him succeed in his career. But at the moment, he's some way from doing that. I don't think we could be looking at Sergio saying, well, P4, P3 even on the grid. I don't think that's good enough, because if you're getting beaten by a slower car, something's gone wrong.
He's got a point to prove tomorrow, hasn't he? Because at least he has a front row star for the Grand Prix. So he's really got to be taking the lead into turn 1 and holding it until Verstappen can take over from him.
But that's the point. He's got Verstappen, who starts P6, who I think none of us are sitting here thinking Verstappen's not going to find his way past Perez, are we? And we're all sort of wondering which lap it's going to happen on. So is that how Perez wants the world to look at him as a driver? Or, given that he's starting that many places ahead of his teammate Verstappen, should he be thinking, well, I'm going to win this race?
Well, let's hear what he was thinking after the sprint race. Here's what he said.
Hey Checo, just what happened? Where did your rear tyres go?
No, we had a lot of damage from Lewis. He basically took the whole right-hand side of the car. So once we realized about the damage, we retired.
What do you make of that incident? He obviously got a 5-second time penalty, but what do you think of his...
Well, that meant game over on my race. Anyway, I look forward for tomorrow. Hopefully tomorrow we can recover those points.
So that was Sergio Perez then having to retire from the sprint race, but he will get a bit of a do-over tomorrow for the Grand Prix when he starts from the front row. Pressure on Perez, that is coming very much so, and has been in the form of Daniel Ricciardo. Back on the grid, of course, last time out in Hungary, into that AlphaTauri. Second weekend back. He finished this race in 10th in that AlphaTauri. Of course, in the sprint, points only go down to the top 8, but that's a top 10 finish regardless. In these tricky conditions for Ricciardo, maybe a bit rusty when it comes to these conditions. How significant is that?
Yeah, people are going to start talking about it just as we are. In fact, we're starting that process.
We're stirring the pot as it goes.
But yeah, of course they're going to start talking in that regard. I mean, look, Daniel Ricciardo came in last time out in Hungary. It was the first time ever inside that car, and he did a pretty decent job. He out-qualified his teammate. It was a strong weekend for him. This time out, he's a bit more familiar with the people around him, the engineers, the mechanics, and of course the car himself. And he's absolutely blown his teammate away, in all honesty. Out-qualified him this morning in the sprint shootout. Out-raced him to 10th position. Yesterday he was quicker in qualifying for the Grand Prix, up until the point where he just stepped over track limits and had his lap deleted, so he'd actually start the Grand Prix further back. So he's got a tough day tomorrow, but his performance, I have to say, I think is looking really ominous, and it will start to have that conversation coming around to being ominous for Sergio Perez.
Yeah, it puts pressure on his teammate Yuki Tsunoda as well, who started behind him in this sprint, as you say, but had a bit of an issue as well on the sprint restart, or the first start of this race under the lights out. But he will start ahead of Ricciardo in tomorrow's Grand Prix, as you say, so it will be really interesting to see how far Ricciardo can get up the field, depending on what the conditions are for the Grand Prix. But it was Ricciardo in 10th. Let's have a look at some of the other players in that top 10. We didn't really talk about the two Ferraris. Sainz ahead of Leclerc, 4th and 5th. A bit anonymous.
Meh.
Yeah, exactly that.
It was, and that's been typical for them on race day, hasn't it? We've seen signs, glimmers of hope in one lap pace in qualifying. In fact, we saw it yesterday with Charles Leclerc. He'll start the race tomorrow on pole position. But in race situations, they tend to struggle to manage tyre degradation, and today was one of those days where the conditions are changing. A lot of this race, albeit a short one, was all about tyre management, and that's where that car doesn't really have the characteristics or the capabilities to deliver when it really matters up against the rest of the field.
Well, Leclerc will start on pole position for the Grand Prix tomorrow. Before we just have a little gander about what that might lead to, I think it's worth touching as well. We talked about Lewis Hamilton finishing down in 7th because of a 5-second time penalty. That still meant he finished ahead of his teammate George Russell, who has had, I'll use your word, a bit of a meh weekend so far as well. He just doesn't seem to have the pace to match Hamilton at the moment.
That's right. I mean, look, we know how good Hamilton is in the wet anyway, and this weekend has been so much about changing conditions, typically from wet to dry. It may well just come down to the experience of Hamilton. I mean, he's one of the most experienced guys out there in those conditions. We know how good he can be. And look, when you're having to decide on things like setup, and you're talking about when to come in to change tyres, when to push, when to back off, where to place your car on a circuit that's continually evolving, It's the experience of the drivers like Hamilton that might be the difference. Maybe George Russell is just still learning that craft a little bit.
Well, George Russell will start from 8th for tomorrow's Grand Prix, or Sunday's Grand Prix, but as I say, it will be Charles Leclerc taking his 20th career pole position. Best view in the house, down into turn 1, alongside the Red Bull of Sergio Perez. We really don't know what the weather's going to do. It's looking a bit rainy, but it can change in an instant in Spa. We've said that so many times, but it really is true. It can. It's such a long circuit. Wet in one part, bone dry in another. What are we expecting, do you think, on lap 1?
Well, I think the beauty is we have no idea what to expect, as you say, and I think if we go on what's happened so far this weekend, I hope the weather's changeable again, because so far I think this weekend has been spectacular in almost every part, hasn't it? It's been drama, controversy, unpredictability all the way through. How many times have we said this season, oh, it's another predictable weekend, it's going to be Verstappen running away with it? And I know that he's already won the race today, he's already been fastest in qualifying, but that's not the whole story. There's been unpredictability, and I want more of that tomorrow.
Verstappen starts 6th with the grid penalty. What lap is he going to take the lead on?
Okay, well, my prediction will be... it's difficult to say because of the weather, but I think if he's not in the lead by lap 5...
I was going to say lap 5.
And they're long laps, aren't they? So maybe even before that. He's got a very, very fast car that he's very comfortable with. It could be lap 3. I mean, who knows?
Well, there'll be 44 laps of that Grand Prix if it all runs to time. But I suppose he is in the danger zone a little bit. In 6th, he's behind Piastri, he's in front of Norris, he's in a McLaren sandwich essentially, and we've seen some big incidents into La Source before, and down into the run to Eau Rouge. Most recently, 2012 comes to mind. Grosjean, Hamilton, Alonso, all involved in that big shunt back in the days. Or we had everybody going left, right and centre in the run down to Eau Rouge. He could find himself in a bit of trouble, so he's also got to keep it clean too.
That is quite simply his biggest risk that might stop him winning this race tomorrow, isn't it? And he's got to be very sensible. I think the old Max Verstappen years ago, who maybe didn't have quite the dominant car, he was a little bit he was not risk averse, rather. He was a bit of a risk taker. He'd quite happily throw his car down the inside. He was aggressive in his driving style, but I think he's matured a bit now. He's got the luxury of a very fast car, so he can afford to lose a place or two if need be. If that's the safest way through the first couple of corners, he can afford to lose a place because he knows within 3 laps with the pace he's got, he can make them back up again.
Well, he can afford to lose places, but Silverstone, remember, slow start. Norris went through into turn 1. If he loses a few, suddenly finds himself in 10th coming into lap 1 and
you
turn
are hopeful,
1.
Aren't you?
I'm just trying. I'm just bringing the Andrew Benson, if he was here, would be bringing me right down to earth right now and telling me to shut up and stop talking nonsense. And maybe we should. But the Grand Prix will get underway on Sunday. Lights out from 2 o'clock on BBC Radio 5 Live. Charles Leclerc starts on pole position in front of Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton and Carlos Sainz sharing row 2. Piastri 5th, Verstappen 6th, Norris, Russell, Alonso and Stroll the top 10. Who's going to win? What's the weather going to do? We have absolutely no idea, so you're going to have to join us to find out. This has been an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live.